Hi, I'm Cameron.
And I'm Hayden.
And this is
Until the End of Crime. Cameron,
Yeah.
What do you remember about the early 2000s?
I remember some national turmoil.
Okay.
I remember chunky highlights.
Okay. Gross. Good.
Girl groups, boy bands were really big.
Yeah. I think I know a few.
Peak girl groups and boy bands.
Right.
Spice Girls, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC.
Were the Spice Girls still going in the early 2000s?
Yes. They're still going in 2024.
Okay, but without Ginger Spice.
I think it's more without Posh.
Okay, but in the early 2000s, didn't Ginger leave?
Yeah, there were some comings and goings.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Early 2000s.
The early 2000s?
Yeah, that's when Ginger left.
Okay, but the Spice Girls were still big.
Okay, you're right. The early 2000s are a little nebulous for me. I obviously remember the World Trade Centers in 2001, sitting in a fourth grade classroom. You were in what, seventh grade?
I was in seventh grade.
What an oldie.
I was in algebra, and then I went to my GT class, and my Texas history teacher was freaking out, and he came into, her name was Miss Schwartz, was my teacher, and he came into Miss Schwartz's room because she had a TV on top of her cabinet, her closet in her classroom, and they had it on, and we all watched as people chose to jump out of the buildings, and it was probably not something that we should have watched at our age.
Yeah.
We shouldn't have been watching it, but...
So 9/11, I remember we were in Miss class, and Miss would step out sometimes to go smoke a cigarette.
Okay.
She would say she was going to use the restroom.
These are different times.
Yes. But every time she came back, she smelled like...
Tobacco.
Right. A new cigarette.
Tobacco.
And I don't remember what teacher it was that came and told her, but she immediately started crying. And I don't know if there's anything more distressing as a fourth grade kid in class to see your teacher just start like wailing and then have her say the World Trade Centers have been like destroyed. And all of us were like, what's that?
Right.
And we had no frame of reference.
Right.
And then they made an announcement.
I'm not even sure that had the terrorism attack not happened, that I would have known, like sitting here right now, that I would have known what the World Trade Centers were.
I don't think I would necessarily have either. They seem to be, like, there's a picture of Miranda when my mom took them to New York. I don't think I was taken on this. I wasn't. I know I wasn't.
Right.
But I might have been born by that time. Mm-hmm. But my sister is like I want to say she's on some kind of like boat.
Yeah.
Passing the World Trade Centers. Probably.
It's probably the same ferry that would take you over to the Statue of Liberty little island.
Yeah. And I'm like, it's so wild to know that she was in front of them and there's this picture of her in front of them. Mm-hmm. But then also it's not, like you said, it's not something I would recognize or know.
Right.
Like maybe after I went to New York.
Yeah, maybe. But then you look back at all of the TV shows where it's prominently featured in the like intro for them. And so there's like a visual awareness, but I probably could liken it to the Taj Mahal. I have no idea about that, but I know what it looks like.
Right. Yes, that's a biggin. I remember that about the early 2000s.
Yeah.
To get back on track.
Okay.
What do you remember about technology in the early 2000s?
In the early 2000s, cell phones were becoming a thing because I got one when I was 12 or 13.
Wow.
Which would have been 2001, 2002.
Spoiled.
And then
2001 cell phone.
Yeah, I had one of those Nokia block ones that you could play Snake on.
Wow.
It was indestructible. I remember when my sister and I would go to my dad's house, we would take turns on the dial-up computer. And I would, there were some websites that I would play games on, but I would also talk to my friends on MSN Messenger. And update my name, of course.
Yes. And
my screen name.
I think there was like a status like away,
yes,
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did the same. And we had dial-up internet, and it was always very touch and go when we would have it. And with that, I remember my brother trying to download music and burn CDs.
Oh, I did that. Yeah.
It was an old HP. It wasn't old at the time, but
right.
Now in retrospect, it probably had 500 megabytes of RAM. I don't know how it ran to do those functions.
Right.
But he would do that. I talked to people on the internet that I had no business talking to, and not always through chat rooms, but I was thinking about it just the other day as I was working on this. And there was a television network called The Inn, and it's what Noggin became in the evening.
Okay.
And they had a website that went with it, the-in.com, and it had message boards. And I would post there all the time. And I remember, so I know I've told you before that I, as a kid, would go into these Yahoo GeoCity websites and different websites and look up spells that I was always too afraid to do.
Yes.
And there was this forum on that website where it talked about being able to bend the elements to your will of fire, air, earth, and water.
Yeah.
And I'd get on there and be like, I can move water with my mind. And people would be like, how?
It's so funny how different, and I understand you were at a very undeveloped mental.
Right.
I mean, you were young.
I don't know. I might have been 5th or 6th grade.
That's still very young. The brain doesn't fully develop until 25.
That's true.
So, but when you say that, my immediate thought is, yeah, but if that were true, then everybody would do it and nobody would have control over the elements because everybody would have control over the elements.
No, it was just meant I don't know, hydrokinesis. If I had a cup of water in front of me, I could make it move.
I know, but if that were something that were available or attainable, then everybody would be able to do it.
Okay, but I didn't say I was Storm from X-Men. I just said that I could control little things of water.
Okay.
The best part is that people believed it. And they were like, how do you do it?
You should believe everything you read from a stranger on the internet.
Yeah, I'm so sorry if you were my victim in the early 2000s.
They've literally not thought about it since.
Okay, well, maybe there might still be people trying to replicate my powers at home. So that's how I used message boards and chat rooms and technology. And I also used MSN Messenger, like you were talking about. So chat rooms.
Yes.
That's kind of where our story is going to be going today. So I want you to picture this. Japan, early 2000s. There was a lot of technological growth and change happening, especially with internet connectivity. And online communities really started to take root and flourish. It offered people a place to connect with others who shared their interests, passions, and sometimes even their darkest struggles. Online chat rooms surged in popularity.
It makes sense that you would be able to share something with strangers who you're very unlikely to ever meet. And now we just have keyboard trolls.
It could have continued on a really positive path, but it didn't.
I think it did both. I think that there are some people who use it for positive and spreading positivity, and then there are others who don't. But we, of course, tend to focus more on the negative because that's what will stick with you longer than any of the positives.
Well, I am positive that today's negative story will stick with you. As part of the boom in internet chat rooms, one of Japan's darkest yet culturally accepted practices found its new home on the internet: suicide chat rooms. Hiroshi Maeue, better known as the suicide website murderer, found the perfect hunting grounds for his eventual prey in these suicide chat rooms. He would engage in conversations with people who were struggling with thoughts of self-harm. He presented himself as being compassionate, an active listener, a kindred spirit who could understand their pain. However, beneath this veneer of empathy lurked a sinister motive. Maeue would use these online interactions to manipulate his victims and exploit their vulnerabilities to lead them down a dangerous path. To really understand Hiroshi Maeue and how he got to the point of being known as the suicide website murderer, we need to rewind the clock and examine the path that led him to this predatory behavior. Maeue was born on August 8, 1968 in Osaka, Japan, And by most accounts, Maeue grew up in an ordinary household. His parents, both factory workers, provided a stable home. And outwardly, there were no signs of issues with Hiroshi Maeue that were reported. One thing I want to state now is that throughout this story, most of the source material was in Japanese and required translation. Also, there were conflicting accounts that were both presented by different news outlets, different resources.
Yeah.
And so in those instances where it's kind of unclear as to what was actually happening, I will include information from both sources.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah, and I imagine that Japanese to English translation, well, any language to language translation is not going to be the most precise thing, but it is my understanding that Japanese is the hardest language to learn, and the second hardest language to learn is English. So I imagine that those two languages probably don't do well when you're translating from one to the other.
Yeah, I don't know even if...
Literally lost in translation.
A master translator probably still struggles to, like, capture context and... What is that thing called? Subtext.
Yeah, subtext, context. I think that there are social things, especially in Japanese culture.
Right. Which is collectivist versus individualistic like the United States.
Right. It is like all of those things that go into language that can't fully be understood necessarily by somebody who just learns a language and tries to translate between the two.
Absolutely. So sometimes in this instance, some of these accounts described Maeue as being intelligent and reserved throughout his childhood. And from what I could find in my research, although sparse for this time period of Maeue's life, Maeue was considered to be a bright pupil, good at school. Beneath this facade of normalcy, of being a regular and bright kid, there was a semi-disturbing fascination taking root.
Okay, but when you say that he was a good student, did he have friends? Like, how was he socially?
Again, source was sparse on this information for childhood.
Okay.
It didn't really talk about his capacity for pro-social relationships. Okay. I don't know.
Family life?
Normal?
By whose standard?
Don't know. That's how it's described.
Okay.
That he had a normal family life with these parents who were both factory workers and provided for him. There isn't much beyond that.
Okay.
Really hard to find information about Hiroshi Maeue's early life, with the exception for what I'm about to share now.
Okay.
So as a teenager, Maeue developed this really strong interest in what you and I might consider a peculiar form of entertainment. This entertainment is called doglegs, or Japanese pro wrestling featuring performers with disabilities or handicaps.
Okay. I'm sure that the etymology is probably not explained, but I have so many questions about how we got to the word or phrase dog legs.
No understanding of the origin, no explanation of the origin, not findable on my part. But what I do know is that news sites such as The Guardian and Vice, the Japan Times, Yahoo News, the Washington Post, and the BBC all ran articles that typified doglegs as a positive, affirming, and liberating activity for those that are disabled in Japan. Doglegs often consist of participants that are either equally handicapped or able-bodied people who have been artificially handicapped for the purpose of the sport.
Okay.
Yes. And from what I have read...
Reminds me of my dad when I was young. He was on a wheelchair rugby league, and my dad has been in a wheelchair my entire life. But the ball would shank off the court, and then, gameplay stops. But then there was a guy who got out of his chair to go after the ball, and that was very confusing for me. So the artificial,
how is he standing? What is he doing?
Yeah.
Dad, can you stand?
Yeah. No, not on his own. Yeah, I think, one, you said that this was probably something that we would find peculiar. You could have just spoken for me on that one.
Well, and I feel like you just described something that's so different to Doglegs in terms of this wheelchair rugby league is obviously meant to be unifying. We have people who are working together in a sport where everyone has been placed on this kind of equal playing field with the intention of creating a stimulating game for everybody. Mm-hmm. Whereas Doglegs, I hate that word. Whereas Doglegs, while they may have a noble cause and purpose, and while they may bring liberation to those who are handicapped or differently abled, they sometimes these what is referred to as super handicapped individuals would face off against able-bodied individuals. And oftentimes they would handicap artificially the individual that was competing against the actual disabled person. It still feels really icky.
Well, I guess it depends on if the people who are participating, I've got a couple questions actually, but if the people who are participating who are disabled, are they being exploited, or are they doing this because they want to do it, or are they doing it because they have to do it because the society hasn't created another space for them?
Well, and we are talking about back in like the 1970s.
Oh,
so
not the early 2000s.
No, not here, because now we're talking about when Hiroshi Maeue was a teenager.
Yes.
Okay. And he was born in 1968. So I guess maybe late 70s, early 80s.
Okay.
And
can I get a little bit of clarification?
Yeah.
On, you said dog legs. I'm not exactly sure when you say dog legs, what are you referring to the...
I don't know if it's the verb form, the noun form. I don't know if it refers to the actual matches, if it is for the participants. That's just how they're kind of referred to overall. Like, they refer to the matches, I'm pretty sure, as dog legs.
Let's go with that.
But I also
that one feels the most comfortable.
Yeah, but I also think they use it to refer to the individuals.
Yeah, we're not going to do that.
No, we aren't going to do that.
We're not going to
do that. When we
say dog legs, we're talking about the matches?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Dog leggers?
No.
That sounds way worse.
You said it was wrestling?
Wrestling.
Okay, wrestlers.
Wrestlers. Okay, these participating wrestlers. Also, again, I can't clarify to what level it was exploitative or coercive, but it's hard for me to imagine, like you were saying, if we're talking late 1970s, there wasn't really any culture that was propagating the acceptance of differently abled people or people living with handicaps. And so I think that at the beginning, at the very least, it probably was to a degree exploitative. You know what? I'm going to normalize saying I don't know enough information to give an informed perspective on whether it's exploitative now. With all of that being said, I do want to note that there's nothing wrong with participating in spectatorship for this kind of entertainment, especially if it is meant to liberate and free these individuals who are participating. However, Maeue's interest went from spectation to obsession. He left fandom and he began spending hours and hours poring over magazines, watching movies on VHS, and meticulously documenting the different wrestlers' moves and statistics. Maeue's fixation on dog legs wasn't just about the spectacle of the sport itself. It was about power, control, and the vulnerability of the performers. He was particularly drawn to wrestlers who were the most physically disadvantaged, those who seemed to be at the mercy of their opponents regardless of the situation. It really, in and of itself, kind of became this fascination with vulnerability. And we'll see how that kind of manifests later.
I mean, I think that might speak a little bit to maybe some of the social stuff that you weren't able to find research on.
It's hard to believe that he would have been pro-social.
Yeah.
I imagine that, well, we know that you can't diagnose a child with antisocial disorder.
Right.
And at worst, you could recognize them as having oppositional defiance disorder, that relatively new diagnosis in the last couple of years. It's like MADD. And I can't remember what that stands for right now, but you can never give someone under the age of 18 a personality disorder, like antisocial disorder. And so even with that being said, what iteration of the DSM were we on in the 1970s?
Yeah.
So, as Maeue entered adulthood, his obsession with dog legs grew, and he began writing letters to his favorite wrestlers.
I think, again, another tick in the probably not very pro-social column.
Correct. So Maeue began to write letters to his favorite wrestlers, and he would express his admiration and sought connection for...
Sought connection?
When his...
I heard sock connection, and I was like, what is that?
I said sock?
No, that's what I heard.
Oh. No, he sought connection. And when his letters went unanswered, he was not a fan of that.
I have questions that you probably also are going to be like, I don't know the answer to that, but I am wondering what the academic attainability was for the handicapped or profoundly disabled or whatever the people who are participating in these doglegs are. And again, my questions about, is this people who are being exploited? Because if they're being exploited or if they don't have the same academic opportunities as the able-bodied or the non-disabled people, then they may either not be capable of responding to the letters, or they might not be interested in it because they are being exploited. Or they may not even know about the letters, because if they're being exploited, then their exploiters may not even tell them anything about the letters.
Right. You know, I think it is complicated. And I think just listening to what you said now, it is possible that if exploitation was an issue, that the person exploiting them might not have even been aware that they were engaging in exploitation.
Right.
For them, it might have been, this is the best opportunity that I can give to this person, or even seen themselves. With all of that being said, I don't have an answer for what kind of education was permitted to them. I'm just more, I guess these are factors that maybe you and I would think about that would prevent us from becoming angry that our letters were going unresponded to. I think today's equivalents would be, oh, I sent this famous person a DM on Instagram and they never replied. Well, you're right. Of course they didn't reply. They've probably got 1 million of those sitting in their inbox, and half of them are hateful. So, well, and also I don't think I gave this context, but I think dog legs were really popular in Japan at this time. I don't think it was necessarily kind of this wildly small niche sport that people watched. I think it was more mainstream than that. Well, that's kind of like what I just said. Yeah. They've got 1 million. I mean, you can't respond to all of there's not time. Right. Or the energy, or even if somebody was writing letters that were hateful, like, hey, you shouldn't be doing this. Even if it was popular, there are still going to be people who are. Yeah. Anyway, sorry. No, that's okay. Well, his frustration with not receiving answers really grew from him admiring to him being frustrated to him becoming resentful. And it started to grow in a desire to cause harm to these wrestlers. Was he threatening them? Not from what I've read. It wasn't that he was necessarily writing threatening letters, but it's understood that he began to grow towards this idea of wishing to cause them harm, or that bad things would happen to them. In 1988, Hiroshi Maeue enrolled at the Kanazawa Institute of Technology. He was studying engineering, and while he was and had been a strong academic, other urges began to take precedent over his desire to learn engineering. Maeue, while at university, attempted to strangle a male friend in his dorm room. It was a shocking act of violence, but it was met with little consequence. Maeue dropped out of the university, and the incident was seemingly swept under the rug. There were no consequences, no follow-up. Instead, Maeue was allowed to drop out and move on. Do you have any, was it you and me sitting here, and then all of a sudden I've got my hands around, do you know if they were wrestling? Do you know if they were having an intimate moment? This is the least reported of all of his crimes, and I think it's because there was no involvement from any kind of officials. He just simply dropped out, and from what I understand, the friend didn't really take any measures afterwards.
Also probably didn't call himself a friend after.
No, definitely not. So I want to point out that at this time in 1988, when Maeue did drop out of university after trying to strangle his, quote, friend, it was also the year that Japan experienced a really terrible economic bubble burst. So people were having a hard time with their employment, with their jobs, investments, and suicide rates in Japan grew rapidly following this bubble burst. Now, this ended up being a pivotal moment in Maeue's life. Here is the first time we know of that he attempted to strangle somebody. And while it was not reported and there was no follow-up, that meant that there was also no kind of check on his behavior. And this pattern would ultimately grow to repeat itself. Now, Maeue went quiet for 7 years. Nothing reportable, nothing available to anyone doing research about what happened in his life from 1988 to 1995. However, in 1995, when Maeue's behavior picks up once again, he makes a really odd and chilling confession to a coworker. Maeue revealed that his obsession with dog legs was more than just watching this disabled pro wrestling circuit. He described to his coworker in graphic detail how he would experience multiple orgasms while watching the matches.
And is fixated on the more vulnerable people.
Yes.
Yeah.
That had been his fixation point earlier. Mm-hmm. I have to assume it's still true.
Well, I think that if strangling is his thing, and then based on what did you say that they call him?
The suicide website killer.
Okay. I'm going to assume that...
Or suicide website murderer.
With a moniker like that, this is a serialized... Well, you've also given indication that this is a serialized event. Yeah, there's like a power thing. It's...
Something about a power dynamic of wanting to be dominant and maybe even less about being dominant, but having someone be really submissive.
Or creating a circumstance in which somebody is vulnerable to you.
So he talks about how he has these multiple orgasms while watching matches. And then he explains to his coworker that he's really frustrated by the fact that these wrestlers ignored his letters. And he shared with his coworker that he often had fantasies of harming these wrestlers who ignored them, even fantasized about killing them. So we have a really disturbing glance into the mind of Hiroshi Maeue through this report. Would you like to know what Maeue's coworker did after he found this out? He did nothing.
But what would you do?
I'm telling somebody.
That your coworker...
Okay, let's contextualize this. If you had a coworker tell you, I enjoy watching dog legs. I have multiple orgasms while I watch dog legs. And I fantasize about killing the wrestlers who do not respond to my messages. Would you tell your superior?
Maybe.
Loose use of the word superior. Would you tell your administrator or manager?
You know what? I would probably go talk to my department chair about it first and foremost. One, I think our lines of work are very different, so I don't know. This is a cooler conversation that I don't think that I would ever have with a coworker. But I would go talk to my department chair and either let that person handle it or take their advice. Like if they were like, you have to go talk to your principal or the principal. I'm thinking of this as I'm likening it to if my coworker was like, I'm so obsessed with, why is Jennifer Garner the first person that comes to what? Talk about the early 2000s.
13 going on 30.
Yeah. So, but they come to me and they're talking about like, I've been writing letters to these celebrities and they haven't responded, so I'm going to kill them. I would have some awareness that there was some danger. I would probably ask if they had any like plans or anything, because I know people be hopping in their car and driving to California and showing up on doorsteps. But this is the 90s, right?
Yeah.
That is actually when that exact thing happened, isn't it?
I think so. But The source material described it as like giving vivid description of ideations of harming these wrestlers. And I think for me, the fact that it sounds like he went into detail about how he wanted to commit these fantasies, it would have been enough for me to say, you know what, I have a duty to report this to somebody.
But you're thinking about it in a 2024 mindset as somebody who has a psychology degree, who is a social worker.
Right.
You're thinking about it from a very different standpoint than somebody who's in a very different culture 30 years ago.
That's true. Yeah, the benefit of time tells us a different story than maybe what it would have then. With all of that being said, Maewa's coworker did nothing. And maybe it was because he was fearful of repercussions from his company, from Maewa himself, but in his mind, he was able to dismiss it as mere talk, venting a frustration. However, just a few weeks later, Maewa's words turned into action, and he attempted to strangle a male coworker in the workplace bathroom, his hands tightening around his colleague's neck in a terrifying display of violence. Now, this coworker did manage to break free, and finally, someone has alerted the authorities. But the incident was handled with surprising leniency. Maewa reached an out-of-court settlement with the victim, lost his job, and was ultimately given a suspended sentence. I see you have a question?
I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
One, my immediate thought is this is Japan. So when I think of a bathroom, I'm thinking of a U.S. bathroom. I've never been to Japan. Don't know what the bathroom situation is like over there.
I bet they're so much nicer than ours.
I know that their bathroom situation is going to be different because it's an Eastern culture. But I mean, we are vulnerable when we go into a public bathroom.
Very vulnerable.
And that's something that he is looking for in a person, is vulnerability. Mm-hmm. But also it sounds very much like a compulsion.
Right.
Because otherwise, who would compromise their career, their job? It's not a rational...
To do it in the workplace.
Yeah.
There is no sense of rational thinking.
Well, and what is the end goal? Like, would he have strangled him to death?
I think so. Because it sounds like this coworker was able to break free.
Yeah, I mean, you can choke somebody until they pass out without them dying.
Maybe he just had untrained hands. Like, I mean, like, you know, a medical professional would still be able to, like, identify a pulse or a radial pulse, but maybe he...
Well, he got away. That wasn't... We don't know what the end goal would have been. If he would have stopped because he passed out, or if he would have kept going until he was deceased. But still a wild, wild thing to...
Very wild.
Did the coworker stay with the company?
I have no idea. It is worth noting that there are conflicting reports, or rather interpretations of the reports. Some of the resources were, again, originally written in Japanese, and there are some inconsistencies in the material or its interpretation. For example, it is uncertain if the authorities were involved in Maewa's instance at work. However, it is confirmed that Maewa served no time or faced punishment for his attack. Additionally, some reports suggest that Maewa was quietly let go from his job, while others indicate that the police were called, charges were filed, and then Maewa settled out of court and was fired. So there are some really big discrepancies between this source material about what happened after this first incident that was reported. However, I can say that he did not serve any kind of time at this point. Both sources confirm that no time was served. After this instance, Maewa once again goes radio silent, this time from 1995 to 2001. In 2001, Maewa's violent impulses escalated once again. This time, Maewa attacked two different women on a street, attempting to strangle them in two separate instances. This time, the authorities could not ignore his behavior and arrested and sentenced Maewa to 1 year in prison with a 3-year suspended sentence, a punishment that seemed woefully inadequate for the severity of his crimes. After Maewa served time for this instance, or instances, he remained unrepentant and unchanged, and in 2002, mere months after his release, Hiroshi Maeue attempted to strangle a junior high school boy. Thankfully, he was apprehended before he could cause serious harm.
Where?
I believe at the school. Like a restroom at the school. Another restroom.
That vulnerability piece.
Mm-hmm.
And then the age on top of that. What was he doing at a school?
I have no idea. So again, he was apprehended. But this instance, once again, underscored this kind of disturbing pattern that you just pointed out. He finds people in vulnerable positions, or what he thinks of as being vulnerable positions, and attacking them with a seeming compulsion. This time, Maeue was sentenced to 22 months in prison, slightly longer than his previous sentence. By the mid-2000s, specifically 2004, Maeue's life had taken a darker turn. He became isolated and withdrawn and spent the majority of his time in internet cafes. In some instances, it was reported that Maeue spent 22 hours at a time in these internet cafes.
Did it cost?
I have no idea how this man was in an internet cafe for up to 22 hours at a time. Because I go on like 18 hours of being awake and I'm ready for someone to slap me asleep.
Yeah, I think that there are, I mean, when you're addicted to whatever it is that you're looking at, there are a lot of people who will stare at a screen longer than they should because they're chasing that high.
There's a certain pathology here that means that his behavior would not be typical or congruent with what we would consider normative behavior.
Well, you also said that he became isolated and socially withdrawn.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I think that we're putting more ticks in the...
Yeah, progressively worse.
Yeah.
So in his time in these internet cafes, Maeue discovered a new hunting ground for his twisted desires: suicide websites and chat rooms. This marked a new, even more sinister chapter in Maeue's life, one that would inevitably lead to unimaginable tragedy.
I'm going to just go out on a limb here because this is another vulnerable demographic that we're dealing with. He's finding opportunities in which people are vulnerable and he's trying to strangle them in those moments. He's finding groups of people who are vulnerable because they are
arguably some of the most vulnerable groups due to their specific mental illness.
So my out on a limb thinking is that he, when he was young, felt vulnerable. I don't know what exactly happened to him when he was young, but he was in a position where he felt like he was powerless and he was at the will of somebody or something else. And he's been trying to flip the script. Mm-hmm. And the door was opened with the dog legs, but then we see how that kind of progressed into a fixation that became his vengeful, I want to kill them because they're not responding to me.
Right.
And I see kind of an evolution here, but I would be willing to bet that there was something either that happened in his childhood or something about his childhood that made him feel powerless. And he's trying to fix that because that bothered him so much.
And I know I'm going to say this and you're probably going to agree with me. I don't want to speculate on what behavior or what instances in his childhood might have led to this, just because I feel like I feel like I don't know enough. And I think, which not that you and I do and not that our listeners would, but I do think occasionally people will hear something to the effect of what you just said. And sometimes that behavior doesn't have what is the word I'm looking for? Doesn't have necessarily a catalyst or this instigating factor to this really terrible behavior. And so I don't want to speculate on that, but I do understand what you're saying. I think it's a plausible theory.
Yeah, I mean, it might not even be something that the majority of people would have been made to feel powerless in. Mm-hmm. There was a scenario in which that very likely happened. And he's been trying to... Whether it's even relating to, like, it could be a comic book where he relates to the villain or he relates to the vulnerable... Are you sure you haven't
watched Criminal Minds?
I'm sure. Relates to the vulnerable party and then tries to align himself with the villain or with I don't know. There was some exposure to something that made him feel powerless and or want to align himself with the villain, or with the, not the villain, and the party that was the most powerful.
Okay.
Or that he perceived to be the most powerful.
To kind of contextualize just how densely populated Hiroshi Maeue's hunting ground was, in 2005, suicide pacts hit an immense level of popularity in Japan. And Japan boasted, well, I shouldn't say boasted, but were victim to having the highest rate of suicide for any industrialized nation. In 2005, suicides within Japan were at 24.1 for every 100,000 people. In juxtaposition, the United States suicide rate at that time was 11.9 per 100,000 people. Now, while Japan's suicide rate has decreased over time down to 18.5, it's still a largely culturally accepted and tolerated practice. So I want to give listeners the context of understanding that in Japanese culture, it's not quite as taboo as it is here in the United States or other Western countries. Now, Maeue, with his predatory instincts honed by years and years of unchecked violence, saw these online spaces as a fertile ground for manipulation and exploitation. He also recognized the vulnerability of those seeking solace in these forums and used it to his advantage. Again, Maeue would present himself as being someone who could relate to the feelings and pain that so many of these people exhibited in these chat rooms or message boards.
I feel like this is maybe a tick in the pro-social column, because being able to relate to, even if it's just...
But he's emulating relation.
I know that he's emulating it, but based on a lot of the behaviors that I've heard about, to me, it seems like he would have a difficult time assimilating because he lacks the ability to emulate those types of... or to mirror that behavior. That's where people who typically end up like more in isolating or choosing to isolate themselves, they struggle to be able to have those social encounters in a way that is acceptable.
I want you to correct me if I'm wrong. With psychopathy, while people that suffer from psychopathy don't have the capability of really feeling emotions or understanding people's emotions, they can be particularly adept at emulating and creating situations that makes it seem as if they understand the emotions, or they know how to operate within that social standard and can present that way.
It is my understanding that people with psychopathy are not incapable of emotions. They're just incapable of really attaching those emotions to other people or being able to relate to other people's emotions about things. They don't think about others so much, but they are capable of emotion. Their emotion is just usually centered around themselves. Okay. They cannot step outside of that and apply or analyze the emotions of others or feel things for others in a way that they feel them for themselves. It's like all of their emotions are turned inward.
But they can accurately feign empathy.
Well, I think because they do have the capacity to have emotions, they just don't. They have to figure out a way to work in the world. Because as a child, they were scolded for not following the status quo on how you behave in a situation or how you treat other people. So they figure out how to assimilate into the society because they have to have that desire to do that. Typically, though, a lot of what they end up doing is figuring out how to manipulate people because they're just trying to serve their own purpose. I could be completely speaking out of my ass, though, but that is my understanding, is that in a lot of cases, they're actually just not capable of giving a fuck about anybody else.
While Maeue may have been able to portray these feelings of sadness and relatability with these individuals,
I wonder if he was pretending as much as... That's kind of kind of my point is I either think that he is more socially adept than I was giving him credit for initially, or what I think is the most likely scenario is if he does create or crave this power dynamic where he is not vulnerable, I go back to, I think that he has at some critical point in his development been made to feel vulnerable. And so I think that he may actually be relating to these people, but not doing it in order to connect, doing it in order to manipulate.
Yeah.
He may be able to relate to some of these feelings of like low self-worth and all the things that would lead somebody to a chat room like this. I don't know that he ended up in this chat room completely by accident, but I don't think that he was going there thinking, let me go and find victims here. I think that may be what it evolved to, but I don't think that's how he got there.
Right. Let me tell you more and see if that affects your perception.
Okay.
So in these instances, Maeue would often offer to these people he was connecting with a way out, a suicide pact. Maeue would portray himself as wanting to end his own life and to take the lives of others to fulfill these dark fantasies of control and domination. As Maeue continued down this path of depravity, his online persona took on a really interesting duality. He presented himself again as this compassionate listener who understood pain and despair, and then planned through the duration of these conversations how he would lure these victims and exploit their vulnerabilities in order to eventually end their life.
Had he killed up to this point?
Not that there's record of.
Okay.
As Maeue continued to frequent these chat rooms of desperation and hopelessness, he encountered a young woman named Michiko Nagamoto. Michiko Nagamoto has been described as a beautiful 25-year-old woman who struggled with depression in the aftermath of a failed relationship. Maeue, with this carefully crafted online persona, offered Michiko solace and understanding. He listened to her pain, validated her feelings, and ultimately proposed a way out, a suicide pact. As their conversations deepened, Michiko sought out more connection with Maeue, ultimately trying to convince Maeue to engage in a webcam call with her. But Maeue said that he didn't have an operable webcam, that it had broken. So instead, he sent a picture.
It's giving catfish.
Very catfish, because he sent a picture of a very attractive 20-something Japanese man that was not him at any point in his life.
Do you know I assumed that he sent a Japanese man?
That's good. That works. Michiko and Maeue exchanged more than 20 email messages throughout the duration of their semi-relationship. All of Maeue's messages contained urgings for Michiko to join him in a suicide pact. He did everything he could to make it as easy as possible to agree. He offered his car. They would light charcoal and poison themselves together. However, by the end of their correspondence, roughly February 19th, 2005, Michiko was really no longer interested in ending her own life. However, Maeue continued to push for a meeting, for them to meet in person. These details are a little fuzzy about what Maeue was really pushing for, whether he still continually pushed for execution of a suicide pact, or if he kind of slacked off and tried to instead just get her to agree to meeting. Getting her to agree to meeting seemed like the most sensible angle to me. Ultimately, Michiko does agree to meet with Maeue, although she still remained resistant to the idea of now completing the suicide pact. On February 19th, 2005, the same day their email correspondence stops, Michiko met Maeue in the alleyway behind her home. But the man who greeted her was not the very attractive, compassionate man that she had been talking to online. And when Michiko questioned Maeue because of his level of unkemptness, his weirdly menacing aura, Maeue claimed that he was just the father of the person she had been speaking to. And he would take her and pick her up, and they would go meet his son.
Honestly, the red flag is her believing that somebody would have procreated with somebody that she was so...
There's no way he could have been responsible for half of the genetic code of the young man's picture he was using.
Right.
Once inside the car, Maewa's true intentions became horrifyingly clear. He drove with Mashiko, overpowered her, and then rendered her unconscious. He then drove to a remote area in the mountains of Kawachinagano, Osaka Prefecture. There, he ended up binding Mashiko's limbs with a combination of ropes and tape, ensuring that she wouldn't be able to escape. When Mashiko regained consciousness, she found herself in a living nightmare. Maewa was filming her with the camcorder. He began to strangle her, relishing her struggle for breath, the terror in her eyes. Later, when confessing to authorities, Maewa said, "I wanted to watch a face in agony." Mashiko's life was extinguished in that desolate mountainside, her body partially buried in a shallow grave. Maewa had not only taken her life, but had also captured the gruesome act on film, a trophy of his depravity. Mashiko's disappearance triggered a missing persons report, but initially there were few leads. Her parents, both distraught and desperate for answers, discovered the email exchanges between Mashiko and Maewa. They alerted the authorities, who were able to track down Maewa through car rental records and eventually arrested him at one of the internet cafes that he frequented. I was waiting so long because your face kind of looked like you had a question, but I wasn't sure, and then I just kept waiting.
Well, my question is, they agree to meet up. He tortures her and kills her, and then...
Records it,
but they are able to trace him to her murder.
So, in this instance...
And she's the only victim?
Mashiko is not the only victim. However, it is when Mashiko's parents file that missing persons report, and they discover the email correspondence, and then track him down through car rental records, that...
They find leads to other...
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it's through this one crime, which was the last crime he committed, that ended up helping investigators realize, oh, he's responsible for these other disappearances. Maewa's arrest marked the beginning of the unraveling of his twisted web of deceit. As the sun rose on a crisp June morning in 2005, a hiker in the mountains of Kawachinagano, Osaka Prefecture, stumbled upon a gruesome discovery. A young boy, no more than 14 years old, lay lifeless on a blanket, his body partially decomposed and showing signs of a violent death. The boy was later identified as Shiatani Moru. Shiatani Moru's parents, prior to the discovery of his body, had received a ransom demand for 3 million yen, or at that time, $23,000 American. They held out hope that they would eventually find their son alive. However, ultimately that was not the case.
Do we know how he went missing?
I'm not exactly sure how he was abducted or what happened exactly.
If he thought he was meeting other 14-year-olds.
I believe that was the idea, that he thought he was meeting up with someone for a suicide pact. So this investigation into Shiatani's disappearance lasted for several weeks, and they knew once they found his body that they were dealing with the homicide. And one of the things that made it so grossly apparent was that the boy was found naked, his genitalia was bruised, and there were traces of ejaculate on his face. News of this discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Parents feared for their children's safety, and investigators worked tirelessly to identify the perpetrator. Meanwhile, Hiroshi Maeue continued his online hunt, unaware that the net was closing in on him. Maewa's next target was Haruko Ito, a 21-year-old college student struggling with the academic pressures of university and the fear of disappointing his family. Maeue, ever the chameleon, adapted his approach to fit Haruko's interest. They bonded over a shared love of the Beatles, and Maeue even twisted the lyrics of "I'm Down" to suggest that the band was actually advocating for suicide in their track. Maeue also found common ground with Haruko and another entertainment outlet, Doglegs.
We got back there. I was really hoping we would circle back.
and we have now circled back, and he used these shared interests to build rapport and trust, ultimately proposing a suicide pact with Haruko. Haruko, overwhelmed by despair and fear of disappointing his family, readily agreed. They met in person, and Maeue suggested they drive to a secluded location to carry out the pact. But as they drove, Haruko began to have second thoughts. He expressed his reluctance to Maeue and that he no longer wanted to commit suicide. Maeue, in the moment, encouraged Haruko that this was fine. This was good. It was no big deal. Maeue convinced Haruko that they could just still hang out. Maeue lured Haruko into a false sense of security. They stopped near a wooded area, and while Haruko was relieving himself, Maeue seized the opportunity. Maeue found a large rock and knocked Haruko unconscious. When Haruko regained consciousness, he found himself in a horrifying predicament. Haruko was hanging from a tree, a noose around his neck, and Maeue was standing nearby, filming with a camcorder and manipulating Haruko's body through the use of a rope, choking the life out of his victim and then allowing him to come back down over and over. Throughout this process of recording and grossly puppeteering Haruko's body, Maeue masturbated. Haruko's body was later discovered hanging from a tree. A suicide note had been planted in his pocket, along with a dog-leg keychain.
What is that?
I don't know.
Why does that make me think of a rabbit's foot?
Because it's a dog leg. Here's the weird part. I researched this case a long time ago, and when I had gone through it, I remembered that was a detail that was so odd and important to me that there had been a dog leg keychain. And then when I was refreshing my memory, I realized that at some point I had forgotten about that dog leg keychain being planted along with the suicide note. And when I rediscovered that, I was like, why? Why would you do this? Was it some kind of like sick and twisted solidarity sign off? Like we both love dog legs?
Was it not his?
I don't know, but those were the only two things that were found. A suicide note and a dog leg keychain. It's not unusual.
Did it have keys?
I don't know. It doesn't say that. It says it was a dog leg keychain. I think it's not weird in the sense that both of these people liked dog legs.
Yeah, that's normal.
Sorry. I meant in the way that if you really like something, you probably have some kind of like memorabilia or item that's related to it. However, the presence of the suicide note did not fool authorities. The circumstances surrounding Haruko's death were too suspicious, too similar to the discovery of Shiatani Moru's body weeks earlier.
In the same location or near?
Every single one of the victims was found in the Kawachinagano, Osaka Prefecture. So this mountainous range of Kawachinagano in the Osaka Prefecture is where he left all of his bodies. Shiatani was the first victim. Haruko was the second victim. And then the third victim was Michiko. And that's when he's initially caught.
I guess what I mean is like he was using a tree at some point in his killing. Were all of the bodies found near that same tree or just in the same general area? I'm
not sure what a close proximity it was, but it doesn't necessarily seem like it was. I think it was more of a generalized area.
Okay.
The investigation intensified following the discovery of Haruko's body. And after Michiko and Meiwa's online activities were so heavily scrutinized, the analysis of emails and chat logs, the police were able to connect Maeue to both Shiatani and Haruko. And they were finally able to bring Meiwa's reign of terror to an end. On June 8th, 2005, police, armed with evidence gleaned from the victim's computers and Meiwa's own online activity, tracked him down to an internet cafe. Here, he was arrested, and his twisted game of online manipulation and murder were finally exposed. I think it's interesting that Maeue did not resist arrest in any way. Reports say that he almost seemed relieved, as if the burden of his dark secrets had become too heavy to bear. Maeue readily confessed to his crimes, leading investigators to the shallow graves, and Maeue also handed over chilling video recordings of each of their murders. One of the sources...
Of all three?
Yes. One of the sources says that Maeue almost kind of gleefully handed over these tapes, as if he was excited for them to see his handiwork. The evidence against Maeue was overwhelming. The videos, coupled with his confession, painted a horrifying picture of a man who was consumed by a desire to control and extinguish life. He described his crimes in detail, revealing a lack of remorse. He spoke of his victims as objects and talked about his enjoyment of the power and domination. In 2007, Maeue stood trial in the Osaka District Court. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a cold-blooded killer driven by a perverse sexual fetish for strangulation. They argued that he had used the anonymity of the internet to prey on the vulnerable, manipulating them into suicide pacts before taking their lives. Initially, Maeue's defense team attempted to portray him as being mentally unstable, and ultimately they were looking for a lesser sentence. However, when Hiroshi Maeue underwent a psychological battery and evaluation, it was determined that he was fully cognizant of his actions and was legally sane, and he was deemed fit to stand trial and and held fully responsible for his crimes.
There was a lot of thought that went into the before, the during, and the after that would make it difficult to make a case for somebody to plead insanity.
Yes.
Or criminal insanity.
The trial gripped the nation of Japan as the gruesome details of Maeue's crimes were revealed. The public was both horrified and outraged by the callous disregard he had shown for human life. The case raised questions about the safety of online spaces and the responsibility of website operators to protect vulnerable users. And I think that's still a conversation that's important today. What length should a website go to protect its patrons, the people who use the website, to protect the public? On March 28, 2007, the Osaka District Court delivered its verdict. Hiroshi Maeue was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death by hanging. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called Maeue's crimes brutal, heartless, and devilish, stating that they were driven by a deep-rooted, and this is in quotes, deep-rooted and difficult to ameliorate sexual propensity. Maeue initially appealed the sentence, but in a surprising turn of events, he later withdrew his appeal. He told the court that he was willing to accept the death penalty, stating that he wanted to pay for his crimes with his own life. On July 28, 2009, Hiroshi Maeue was executed by hanging at the Osaka Detention Center. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in Japanese history, a chilling reminder of the potential for evil to flourish in the new digital age. Again, the case of Hiroshi Maeue has left a lasting impact on Japanese society. It caused a lot of national conversation about internet safety and mental health and the need for greater vigilance in online spaces. It also led to calls for stricter regulations for suicide websites and chat rooms, as well as increased resources for those struggling with suicidal thoughts. What I really want to say, and something that I find really conflicting, because I believe in autonomy, I believe in people's right to make decisions for themselves. I believe they should be able to communicate openly and without fear of prosecution from the government or entities that could cause them great harm for sharing their ideas. By the same token, I don't know if something like a suicide pact website should be left unchecked. To what degree do I say, I believe you have this inalienable right to communicate openly and freely, and I think there should be stricter regulation on websites that could potentially lead people to taking their own life. I think when I do the impact calculus, especially when I consider things like there are now multiple countries, including Canada, that allow physician-assisted suicide for things like mental health, treatment-resistant depression is a good enough reason for the country of Canada to allow you to go through with physician-assisted suicide. So it brings up really critical questions about ethics and beliefs about autonomy and the right to live your life how you choose, but also wanting to mitigate the effects that lead to things like suicidality and mitigating suicidality itself. Either way, Hiroshi Maeue was a reprehensible criminal.
I'm not disagreeing that what he did was reprehensible. I think something you touched on pretty early on is there were times when he was expressing himself to people who could have intervened or helped him maybe get seen by a professional who could have helped redirect this obsession and fixation with dog legs that ultimately ended up with him becoming really rageful. I was saying earlier that I didn't think that he necessarily landed in the suicide chat room. He did not go there in a predatory role, but then while he was there, he did become a predator. I think it really speaks to his withdrawing his appeal and wanting to end his life to pay for his crimes. I think that also can lends to what I was saying before is I don't think that he ended up in this suicide chat room by accident or with malintent. I think that he went there because he felt vulnerable. I think that he was somebody who had a hard time connecting with people. And when he went there, he did relate to those people. But when he got there and realized how vulnerable they were willing to be with him, he then found the opportunity in which he could find victims that he had been just haphazardly accosting in bathrooms and in the street, right? So I think that there's a lot more. I want to say that you were saying that this was preventable because there could have been intervention sooner that would have saved people's lives. When you were talking about his coworker not telling anybody about his wanting to kill wrestlers who participate in dog legs, I think that would have been an opportunity for intervention that was missed. That was kind of my understanding of what you were saying, is that there could have been an intervention that could have happened at that point that would have potentially helped. I don't know. That was 80s, 90s. I don't know what the psychological field in Japan was doing, or I imagine it was very stigmatized because it's so stigmatized in the US at that point. And my guess is that Japan would have put more of a stigma on something like that, or as much as the United States, if not more.
It's hard to say without...
All of it is hard to say. I mean, so much of this case is literally lost in translation.
Right.
So much of it.
And that's what I was going to say is I just feel like despite this being a case that I worked on and researched, I feel like I still don't know enough to make it would be such imaginative conjecture for me to try and really pinpoint the origin of his what I assume is both paraphilia and other illness that causes him to want to cause harm to others. And it leaves me in this position of, I don't know how Hiroshi Maeue came across these suicide chat rooms. I don't know if it was by accident or if it was intentional or he was seeking his own support at some point in time. This case has a real sense of hopelessness to it because even though Hiroshi Maeue's crimes were discovered and he did go through the judicial system and ended up with a verdict that I think some people would find satisfying, like the death penalty, for a brief moment in time, there seems to be some kind of genuine remorse. Like you were saying, I can accept the death penalty as kind of a penance for having killed these people.
But you said that he didn't feel any remorse.
I don't think he does for the vast majority. And it even talks about how when he's going through the trial, he seems to be remorseless and that he shows the videos to the authorities gleefully. However, he starts the appeal process just to then turn and say, you know what, I accept my punishment, death for their death.
See, I didn't research it, but I'm totally down to speculate with all the information that you gave me. And I think that he is somebody who relates directly to the vulnerable. And I think that it's a matter of self-hate that it's almost like you hate that you feel sad and that makes you want to cry. So then you beat up other kids when you see them cry because you hate when you cry. I mean, I think I've taken that down to like at a child scale for kids that are told that it's not okay to cry. You can't cry. You can't cry. Then when you see somebody crying, punish that other kid for crying because you're not allowed to cry. And so then you're making it so that they're not allowed to cry. I don't know. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I think because I know you find his actions and behaviors just as reprehensible as I do.
Absolutely.
I can't give him the benefit of thinking that he related to his victims, which what you're saying makes sense. Like, I think it's a good, plausible theory. I can't believe that.
I think it makes sense that he wouldn't feel remorse for it, though, because they are vulnerable and he hates that part of himself. He hates the part of himself that's vulnerable. That's why he finds so much joy in seeing vulnerable people tortured, experiencing torture. And you want to say that there was something that happened at a middle school when he choked the kid in the bathroom around 14. Mm-hmm. And then of his 3 murdered victims, one of them was male.
Correct.
14-year-old male.
Shiatani Moru was a 14-year-old male.
So I want to say that is very likely, especially considering the time that he became fixated on dog legs and all of that something happened at that stage in his life when he was about 14. Maybe. I know it is all speculative, but that's what I do. It's
listen,
what I live for.
I know.
I love that.
You've got it. You're dug in. It's not dug in a negative way, but like you have your theory, and I think it works.
Okay. Knowing nothing about anything, I do want to say that you did really well with Japanese names in a way that I don't know that I would have done. I was impressed.
I appreciate that because I feel like a person who speaks fluent Japanese might be less impressed by what I did today.
That was why I gave the disclaimer. I was like, I don't know anything about anything, but to me, it sounded good.
Right. I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that part of what motivated me to research this case was kind of the outlandish nature of the obsession with dog legs. And
yeah, thanks for bringing that to us.
You're so welcome. And I think for me, I found that so appalling and surprising that I felt like I had to talk about it with somebody. And so
here I am.
Well, thank you for engaging with me in that. And listeners, some of our content in today's episode revolved around suicide and feelings of suicidality. And I want to make sure that you understand that there is also someone that you can express your concerns and needs to. If you find yourself in the position of feeling suicidal, you can reach out to the suicide hotline at 988.
Yeah, or any mental crisis.
Any mental crisis hotline.
988. A complete list of sources and any links can be found in the show notes.
And that's all we've got for this episode. If you enjoyed listening and want to hear more, please subscribe and drop us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening.
Recommend us to a friend and make sure you're following us at End of Crime Pod on Instagram.
Like us on Facebook at Until the End of Crime and join our discussion group.
Our email address is endofcrimepod@gmail.com, so send us an email with questions, requests, or episode suggestions.
Thank you for listening.
Until the next crime.